from 120,000, which was a pretty good situation, to 4,500, which is not a good situation. And so we had a very drastic runoff. The other thing is the green line there is basically USDA numbers. And so one of the things you can end up seeing is that Kansas does generally follow US numbers. Although if you look at where we are now, essentially USDA is not picking up this as wide, nationwide. However, if you look at probably the Midwest, specifically if you look at US or Illinois numbers, Illinois, their net farm income for last year was negative $2,000. And so they actually ended up in a little bit worse situation on average as we did in Kansas. And so certainly there, and then if you look at USDA numbers, they suspect that 16 will not be as good as 15. In Kansas, we're probably going to end up maybe seeing a little bit of a bump up from 2015 to 2016, and it'll be a little bit of a bump up, primarily because of the good crop production statewide. Certainly the prices are quite a bit lower than they were last year, but the price is there. In terms of the other thing I think it's important to realize is people a lot of times ask, well, where's the sector that's making money? Unfortunately, there really isn't one right now. In terms of crops production, their incomes are down. In terms of the livestock numbers are down. And so right now, there really isn't a bright spot in the Kansas agricultural economy. I think, though, the other thing that's pretty important to consider is that this is, not everybody is in the same boat, and there is a distribution around here. Looking at this graph here, it kind of gives you a little bit of a distribution in terms of those that earned more than $250,000 in 2014 were 15%. And so 15% of the farmers in Kansas in 2014 earned more than $250,000. 26% kind of earned in that $100,000 to $250,000 range, and that drops all the way to 3% lost between $100,000 and $250,000, and about 1% lost more than $250,000. So a very wide distribution. Again, just to let you know, you do have these slides in your booklet if you do want to follow along. But then when we went from 2014 to 2015, we ended up seeing a drastic movement of that distribution to the left. There still were some farmers that did very well last year. In terms of about 4% of the farmers in Kansas earned more than $250,000. But if you look at the other side, 10% lost more than 50 but less than 100. 8% lost more than 100 but less than 250, and 4% of the farms ended up losing more than 250,000. And so we had a drastic change from 2015 to 2014 to 2015. In fact, the net farm income number in 2015 was the lowest since 1985. And you start hearing numbers the lowest since 1985, or any numbers that end in the 1980s, it's not a good situation. Couple numbers here that kind of look at this. One of the numbers that is important, I think, to consider, and this is actually where we're in a fairly safe position yet, is this purple line that measures the debt to asset ratio. In the 1970s, we were kind of down in the 20s. Through the trouble of the 1980s, we went from entering the cycle of about 25%, ended up about 37% average debt to asset ratio. Then it's important to realize that we kind of hung in this 35% range all the way from the mid-1980s all the way to 2005. And so it's pretty important that Kansas farmers for a long time managed quite a bit more debt compared to assets than they are now. Then we got to the good times. Debt went down relative to assets quite substantially, and a lot of that was the run-up of the assets. We actually ended up as safe as we've been over this period of time. In 2014, where we ended up at 19.7%, and then we ended up increasing to about 23% over there. Probably the number that's most concerning is this number in red, and this is the capital debt repayment capacity. What this is it's saying, do I have enough income in order to pay my principal and interest? And essentially, so we take net farm income, we add on any off-farm income, then we end up subtracting off family living in terms of you have to certainly have your family living there. We also assume you're paying taxes, and so we take off any taxes. And so the rest that's left there is essentially to pay interest and principal. In terms of looking at this, ideally, this number, and this is the red number axis, is going to be 100%. What that says is at least we have enough cash to pay off my principal and interest. In terms of looking at this number, we were kind of in this 150 range in the good times. Basically what that meant is we had 50% more cash than necessary in order to pay our principal and interest. In terms of looking at that from the good times, that began to deteriorate. In 2014 was the first time in quite a while that fell below 100%. And so we had 94%. That meant that essentially in 2014, the average farm was 6% short. Last year, it fell to 16%. That means that the average farmer was about 84% short of earnings, meaning that they're going to have to take cash someplace else off their balance sheet in order to make those payments. The 16%, lowest since 1981. Again, not good comparisons with regards to that. And so this kind of summarizes what we covered in terms of the financial situation. And Michael is going to talk about what drove that farm income.
I don't. Okay, can you hear me? Are we picking up on the mic? Okay, now we are. I'll talk a little bit louder. So I have two microphones, which means what I have to say is twice as important as what Dr. Featherstone had to say. Okay, so can you answer the question, what drove the change in farm income? All right, for those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I don't ask a lot of rhetorical questions. I prefer to ask questions that I know you can answer. So the sooner that you answer them, the quicker we move on to the next slide. Smile. Just smile this morning. Okay, there we go. Hey. All right. So what drove the drop in farm income? What happened? Yeah, commodity prices. Where'd they go? In the tank. Okay? Commodity prices went in the tank. All right, so this drove the fall off in farm income. So that's what's been happening. Let's talk about what we think is going to happen going forward. So economists make weather folks look real good when we do forecasts, okay? But we've got a few bits of information that we can put together and try to come up with a forecast of where we think we're going to be. And one of the ways that we do that is we look at the futures market and we say, okay, what is that implying about our about cash prices for the next couple of years? So the trick to doing this, of course, is that you want to take that futures price and you want to subtract off a basis level. And we use 33 cents under for basis for wheat from Salina. Hey, that's better. Thank you. Now, is that the basis right now in Salina? You think Salina's 33 cents under? It's not. It's closer to $1.50. Okay? We've got a wheat basis problem this year that's adding insult to injury when it comes to the wheat crop. But we don't expect that basis to be as wide next year. We hope that basis is not as wide next year. And so we're using a historical average. So let's take a look at what that implies about the prices going forward. It doesn't push prices back up. Right now, the futures market is just indicating a flattening of prices where they stand. There's no reason for them to push them up, and there's no real reason for them to push them down. So that's kind of where we stand. Well, if we take those commodity prices and then, well, let's see. If we take those commodity prices as what we think it's going to be, well, what potentially affects our forecast? The accuracy of the futures market is pretty, I mean, we think it encompasses as much information as possible, but let's take a look at what the futures market prices can do over time. Okay, so when I show this slide to some of the students at K-State, I say, so downward price trend, right? But there's been some peaks, so when you're marketing your grain, you just need to market it at the peak and then you'll be okay. Okay? And some of them in the room, yeah, okay. And some of them in the room are like, yeah, right. Okay, so that's the problem, is that we have this overall downward trend, but we've also got a lot of volatility in it. So how do you know when those prices are going back up and when they're not? That's a problem. So a lot of volatility. What else affects our forecast? Well, this chart right here is the exchange rate between US and the Brazilian currency. Why do we care about Brazil? What do they grow? I'm gonna get you to answer a question before I leave here today, okay? Yeah, they grow beans. And right now, given the exchange rates, they're looking at really valuable beans, and so they're planting as many as they can. In fact, what this is doing to US commodities is the stronger our dollar is, the more expensive our commodities are. And so our typical buyers are looking for other places to buy their grain because it's cheaper in other places. This carries over even into US buyers of grain. So this past summer, the Wall Street Journal ran an article saying that the Southeast US poultry producers were bringing in beans from Brazil because it was cheaper to bring them in from Brazil than it was to bring them in from Iowa. Okay? So we've got a lot of things working against us right now. It's not like we haven't seen these commodity prices before, okay? We've seen these prices before. In fact, they're pretty similar to what we saw in 2007 and 2008. The difference between then and now is our cost of production. Cost of production, these are just variable costs. You might call them cash costs. These don't include the fixed costs of land and some other things, and depreciation. But this is the variable costs of growing these crops, and what you can see is that they've gone up significantly over the last 8, 9, 10 years, and that's what's making our profitability so poor, because prices dropped off very quickly, but cost of production hasn't adjusted to meet that. And one of the areas, for example, let's just talk about cash rents for a second, that does not adjust as quickly as commodity prices do, okay? So prices have fallen, and we are definitely in a global market when it comes to being exposed to that kind of price risk. The cost of production has gone up since the last time we saw prices like this. And so this has implications for our ability to repay debt. And I'm going to hand them back over to Alan to discuss that.
Again, we had indicated that repayment capacity is pretty key, simply because that generates you the income in order to make the payments to the lenders, but also to invest, expand your operations, make other types of decisions. Essentially, you look at these numbers and you start panicking a little bit, simply because there's a lot of similarities to where we are now. Except where we are now, we went about 4 years it took us to get there. In the 1980s, it took us 2 years. From 1979 to 1981, repayment capacity fell from 153% to 16%. Here, we went from 149% to 16% over a 4-year period as opposed to a 2-year period. Two key factors affected that. The first was interest payments increased by 65%. Interest rates back then were probably 13, 14, 15, 16, 17%. And for those that haven't farmed for a long time or haven't paid attention for a long time, those interest rates sound unreal, given where we are now. In some respects, the interest rate is probably one of the positive things that may make where we are now different than we were in the 1980s. The second thing was the decline in the value of farm production fell by 15.7%. We've probably ended up doing more than that, kind of where we were from the peak in terms of the value of farm production. Land values couldn't be supported any longer. Repayment affected. Again, this graph here basically just gives you the percentages in Kansas since 2011, went from 150 to 16%. Again, looking at the comparison with the 1980s, it's pretty close. The other thing I think that's important, and this kind of looks at the probability of default on the farms. The key thing off this graph is to realize that we're relatively safe. We are in a very safe position compared to where we were in the 1980s. And so in some respects, the safety is another thing, is that farms are in a very safe position going into this downturn. And so 1 or 2 years probably isn't going to be a major effect, but maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 years, if it would last that long, would end up being an issue. Again, I think the important thing to remember is there's the distribution. Not all farms are the same. In terms of some are much more profitable than others. Some are, their balance sheet is in better situations than others. And so there is a distribution around here. Repayment capacity certainly is key. 2016, while I think some incomes, and in fact Southeast Kansas, looking at the incomes, maybe bounce a little higher simply because there's more beans grown here in the state. If you look at what's going on in the western part of the state, where there's a heavy reliance on wheat and all the issues with the wheat basis, they're looking for a much more difficult 2016 than they were in 2015. But certainly 2016, while it may be a little bit better in parts of the state, it's not substantially better. Probably what we're most concerned about is if we go back to normal yields at these prices. And so probably looking at these in terms of the 3 years, 2015, 2016, and 2017, unfortunately 2017 looks the worst, at least where we are, if we go back to normal yields. Simply because prices, unfortunately, Kansas isn't going to move the world market probably too much in prices. And so we're going to need a drought someplace across the world, or we're going to need a huge increase in the global economy, especially in Asia, in order to bounce those prices up in 2017. The important thing is it can happen, but that's not the expectation. And so the expectation is that prices will be level, kind of in that $4 range for corn, probably in that $9 to $9.50 range for beans, and kind of approaching $5 for wheat over the longer term. Looking at crop revenue insurance, in terms of crop revenue insurance, certainly does a great job from yield, but the problem is that the prices adjust every year. To give a little bit of an indication there, I have an example here of soybeans, or corn. I'll go for corn first. Essentially, I'm just choosing round numbers, but let's say your APH was 150, you chose 80%, that would essentially guarantee you 120 bushels. In 2013, the base price was $565, and so at those levels, you would have $678 of coverage per acre. You look at what happened in 14, declined 565 to 462, then 462 to 415, then 415 to 386. And the price for 2017 is not yet set, but using the way that they calculate that in current futures prices for the December 17 contract, we're probably looking at a little bit more slippage in the corn guaranteed price. My estimate, if I had to do one, would kind of be in that 378, 380 range. But looking at this, farmers are managing 33% more risk than they were when they put in the 2013 crop. And so as you're putting in the 2017 crop, you're got to handle 33% more risk. Soybeans in some respects is the bright spot in terms of if prices do not change drastically from where they are, we may be looking at a guaranteed price of about $10 per bushel. And again, kind of looking at that, that's kind of better than it was in 2016 for sure, and perhaps in 2016. In terms of seeing these numbers between corn and soybeans, thinking about what they're going to do in Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana, if you were farming there and looking at these prices, what are you going to think about as you look for your 2017 crop? You're going to probably see a lot of beans. And so certainly that may be some thoughts with regards to how you want to do some marketing strategies in terms of if there are possibilities to lock in some profits by pricing or forward contracting. That may be something to consider, simply because I think farmers respond to price incentives, and the price incentives right there are soybeans. We'll also look at wheat. Wheat is a very ugly picture in terms of essentially the crop that just went in the ground went in at a 459. Actually, the 2018 crop that'll be planted in the fall of next year actually bounces up a little bit, but essentially you're looking at about 50% more risk. And so essentially, this is also one of the reasons the state economy is in the position it is, simply because a lot of wheat is grown west of Highway 81, and you can kind of look at what's happened to the position of the wheat farmer. The other thing is there's a safety net. Certainly the safety net is there, but unfortunately the safety net is being lowered at the same time prices is going down. And so again, it's kind of not a good picture in terms of usually when there's more risk, you kind of want that safety net pretty solid. But the way the programs are working, unless you're in PLC, that safety net is dropping at the same time incomes are dropping. And you can see very relatively low PLC enrollment in Kansas. Earlier in the price, and there will be prices from time to time from a marketing perspective, those opportunities aren't really there. Essentially, probably soybeans kind of has the brightest outlook for 2017. Probably going to take wheat into 2018 to rebound. Whether or not we're going to have LDPs certainly is an issue. Some of the wheat that they've piled up in western Kansas, they're not anticipating moving that until 2018. And so those piles out there, maybe they're through the summer all the way into 2018 before some of those are moving. And so this, we'll let Michael talk about how this is going to affect the
And Alan Featherstone, also known as Vanna White, will be advancing the slides for me this morning. We're going to have to get you a sequin dress. Okay. Thank you. Can't move on until he smiles. Okay. So this is a chart of Kansas state level land values going back to 1950. Now, I know that land values vary across the state, certainly, but when we look at a long-term trend, it's okay to use these state level values because they give us a pretty good sense of what's going on. And what you can see here is that we've had two big run-ups over this 65-year period of time. And the first run-up was in the mid to late 70s. And it was in response to the really profitable farming that we had, right? The returns to farming. And then it crashed. Okay, so one of the problems with the 1980s, one of the reasons that we started to see land values fall was that, well, the profitability was low, but we also got to a point where folks had to find a way to be able to pay off debt, to be able to keep things moving, and some land got sold as part of that process. We don't see a lot of land turnover in the state on an annual basis. It's not like, every piece of ground is available for sale every year, right? So it doesn't take a lot more land up for sale to really drive those prices down, even in a local area. So that's kind of what happened. Now take a look at this run up that we're just coming off of more recently, and it's even more dramatic, honestly, compared to that 70s run. Now these are real prices, not nominal. So we took out inflation So that is to me, it's more striking how fast we've run up land values over the last 10 years or so, and how we've seen them they've already started to fall off a little bit. And the question becomes, where do we go from here, right? Now, if you get a PhD in economics, what that allows you to do is take a red pen and make lines about where you think land values will go. But you have to have a PhD in order to do that, okay? So here's 3 scenarios. One of them is we just stay flat, right? And if commodity prices were to recover today and everything was to be okay, maybe that would happen. But that's not exactly what we're thinking, and it's not what we need to be preparing for. The second line is going back to a growth rate that I would say is a little more aggressive than perhaps that historical growth rate that's at the bottom, that bottom red line. So we could go back to that level where, you know, we're at a new, more aggressive growth rate, and that's possible. Or we could go back to something that would look a lot more in line with that historic norm. And to get to that point, we're going to have to see a pretty strong drop off in land values. So we've done some research using about 40 years worth of data. Oh, sorry. Okay, yes, we did some research using about 40 years worth of land values and returns to farming for Kansas. And what we're trying to do is figure out, okay, if we project forward what the returns to farming will be over the next couple of years, what does that do to land values? And so here's those projections going forward, and you can see that income is being projected right now at just shy of $50 an acre. That's that red line. And that's based off of what we're projecting for returns to corn, beans, and wheat. And what happens here is that if we keep that net farm income at just shy of $50 an acre, and we go forward with that for the next couple of years, well, the long run land value that reflects that level of profitability is about 50% lower than where we were at in our peak in 2015. So that means that if we stay basically right where we're at today and we carry that forward for the next couple of years, we could see land values fall off by about 50%. And to be honest with you, they've already fallen off, I think a total of, was it 12 or not? 10, 12%. So we're already on our way. The question there is, okay, so how fast does that happen? Right? How long does profitability have to stay low to get back to that point? And that's a trickier question to try to answer. That one again comes back to how many times that we see farms having to liquidate that land and having to sort of force sales. When I visit with appraisers and farm managers and some auctioneers from around the state, for this whole year, for 2016, what they started seeing at auctions was a combination of good land that was still selling at a pretty good price, but they started seeing more and more land, typically lower quality, that was not meeting reserve, which meant that the seller had a price that they were trying to get, but those last bids didn't get to that point, and they didn't let it sell. They said, okay, well, if I can't get the price I want, I'm not going to let it sell. Well, that's an option that you have if you're not being forced into selling that ground, right? But as soon as you have to sell that ground, not meeting reserve isn't an option. So we know that the demand for land has softened quite a bit, but how far it's softened, we won't really know until we start to see that land actually trade hands, okay? So land values are a concern. We certainly know that the profitability does not support where land values are at today. And to be honest with you, the rental rates probably don't support where we're seeing profitability today, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in another section. And so in order to get these land markets back to historical norms, we're gonna have to see some declines, and we've already seen them. So it's just a question of how much more and for how much longer. But as soon as you start seeing land values fall, that makes the bankers in the room nervous, right? Because it's not about whether or not you're actually going to sell your ground or trying to buy ground. It's more about the value of that as collateral for your loans, right? And so that's the thing that, you know, your ability to borrow, your ability to get operating notes is going to be based on the value of your assets. And we're looking at the possibility of the value of those assets across the board falling quite a bit. So on that happy note, I'm going to pass it back over to Dr. Featherstone.
We're going to change gears here and move into looking at the debt position. Certainly, we saw that debt-to-asset ratios were decreasing over time, but was that due to the numerator, the debt decreasing, or was it due to the denominator, the assets increasing? Basically, looking at this picture, the average debt level has went up. In terms of in 2005, 10 years ago, average Kansas farm had $320,000. In 2015, that average Kansas farm had $570,000 of debt. In terms of looking at it, certainly we've seen a run up here quite substantially over the last 3 years. From 2012 to 13, we increased it by 40,000. From 2013 to 2014, we increased it by 47,000, so that's up to 87. And then last year, we increased it by 23,000. And so looking at that, over the last 4 years or 3-year period, we increased the debt level by $110,000 per farm. Looking at that, 110,000 divided by 400,000 roughly ends up increasing 25%. And so we have seen substantial run up in debt. In terms of where that was, in 2013, that change in debt, essentially most of it was at the current side. And so we may have been buying equipment, but if we were financing it with short-term debt. If we were buying land, we were financing that with short-term debt. Or the other possibility is that prices, when you pulled off the 2013 crop, were they good or were they not so good compared to what you had seen in 2012, 11, 10? I don't know if you can remember back. The fall harvest of 2013, the prices weren't very good. And so a lot of producers said, you know, I'm going to hold on to that crop and hope that the prices increase into 2014. And so at the end of the year, they had to essentially finance that simply because you had to finance those inventories into the next year, or possibly they didn't have profitability. But from 2013 to 2014, was that a good strategy to hold those crops and sell them into 2014? That actually was. That was the right strategy to do. And you can tell that because the 2014 income was pretty good. And so from 2013 to 2014, those that ended up holding off selling and selling in 2014, they made money because prices bounced up pretty good. There were opportunities to sell. So that worked from 2013 to 2014. So from 2014 to 2015, we said we're going to try that strategy again. And so now we took 80% of that 47,000 also on the current debt side. Did that work so good from 2014 to 2015? No. Not only did the prices not go up, they went the other way, they went down. And so the perfect strategy for 2013 crop was exactly the wrong strategy for the 2014 crop. And that's what makes farming so difficult, is that the strategies from one year to the next change such that when you look back, the strategy that you used wasn't there. It may be totally different. But the key thing is that this is beginning to indicate that we're building up some current debt there that is important. In terms of looking at this, can you get a fixed rate on your short-term debt, a fixed interest rate? Not usually. I don't know really anybody that would lend short-term for a fixed rate. Usually it's going to be your intermediate and long-term debt that you can get the fixed rate on. And so given that the Fed just this week increased the interest rate by 1/4 point, is that current debt going to be subject to that 1/4 point interest rate increase? Yeah. And so that's one of the things I think that's going to be very important, is looking at that trade-off with regards to that. From 2004 or 2015, and this should be changing Kansas farm debt 2015, essentially the current debt was 14,000, long-term debt was 13, and we actually reduced the intermediate debt a little bit. And so certainly that picture changed. Debt has increased. The majority of it has been in current liabilities. Those current liabilities, in some respects, that interest rate is going to fluctuate with the economy. There is some indication, however, that farmers are beginning to refinance some of that current debt, moving it more into intermediate or long-term debt where they have more ability to pay that off. But probably more important is it does give the farmer the opportunity to put a fixed interest rate on that, such that if that interest rate increases, they've insulated. They're going to pay about 1.5%, maybe more for that, but it is an insurance policy such that if the U.S. economy gets going, the Fed begins to lose control of inflation, which I'm not saying is going to happen, but it could happen, such that interest rates start increasing. At least that portion of the debt would be at a fixed rate such that that would not be susceptible to interest rate changes. The other thing that's important to realize is how many of you would be pleased if the K-State men's basketball or women's basketball team would shoot 89% on their free throws for the season? How many of you would take that? Pretty much everybody would take that. In terms of the important thing to realize is you may be a pretty good farmer. You may be saying, you know, I'm average or above average, so I'm not sure what the issue is. The important thing to remember is sometimes we look back to the 80s and it's kind of walking uphill both ways to school that my dad did when he walked to school in the old days. It was uphill both ways. I've never figured out how he did that, but he said it, so it had to be true. And so essentially, the important thing to realize is that during the worst time you could be lending from a national lending perspective, at least on land loans, and this is information from an insurance company that lends on land, the worst time they could have been lending on land was 1977 through 1980. They ended up hitting on 89% of the loans they made, 11% they didn't. Some of those were pretty ugly. Some of them hit the rim, hit the backboard, came back, hit the rim, circled around, and finally dropped in. And so as a parent of a kid making that shot, you're kind of on the edge of your seat, but it finally went in, so things are great. And so that's kind of how we ended up in the 1980s. But the key thing is roughly 11% of those loans going bad killed the sector. And so the important thing is that the average is not going to drive the bust. It's going to be the tails. And as Michael indicated, there isn't much land that trades hands in a year, 2 to 3%. If all of a sudden that 2 to 3% went to 4 to 6%, doesn't sound like a very big increase, but how well did we deal with twice as much wheat production in western Kansas? Not well, in terms of we ended up with a lot of piles. And so doubling the volume makes a big deal, which is not a very big percentage. And so the key thing I think that's important to remember is the tails drive the average. And again, you hear all these stories about there's all kinds of off-farm investors coming in and buying farmland. The most recent numbers are 80% of buyers of farmland are other farmers. And so the local dentist or the hedge fund out in New York coming in buying land, they only make up 20% of the buyers. 80% of the buyers are still farmland. We like to have stories in the Wall Street Journal about all these non-farm investors coming in and swooping up the land, and it's probably bigger than it was, but it's still only 20% of the market. Debt to asset ratios, this is a positive situation. We are in a relatively strong position, especially compared to the 1970s. We're about where we were. Probably the only disappointing fact is we went through 2015. At the end of 2014, we were much safer. Now we're about where we were in 1979. Again, the important thing to realize is that there's a distribution there. And so certainly these individuals that have very high debt to asset ratios, in some respects, are probably going to end up driving how well we're able to weather this storm. If those end up in situations where there's forced land sales, those type of things, it's going to probably be more difficult than if we can essentially manage through that in another way. One of the ways to look at this is what I ended up doing is I took the balance sheets on all of these farms that we have available to us through the Kansas Farm Management Association. And I said, what happens if I decrease land values by 30% on each of these operations? What would their debt to asset ratio be? In terms of looking at this, and I did it by 10, 20, 30%, you can end up seeing that the picture gets worse in terms of the distribution ends up shifting to your right, and that's not what you want. But the key thing is we still end up with a 30% drop at a 27% debt to asset ratio. What were we managing in the 1990s, early 2000s? What was our average debt to asset ratio? About 30%, 35%. And so the thing is we can probably survive a 30% decrease in land values. It's going to probably take more than that to really end up getting us in a difficult situation. Again, repayment capacity is pretty important, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. 2016 is probably going to erode working capital for a number of farmers in state, probably not so much in southeast Kansas, but certainly for other parts of the state. 2017, again, is probably going to be more troublesome than what we've seen in 2015 and 16. Again, I still think 2016 is going to be a difficult year. I don't think anybody's really thrilled with where 2016 is going to come out. For some individuals, it'll be better than the previous year. But 2017, I think, is really going to be pivotal. And again, we are at levels that we haven't seen from the 1980s. Again, given where we are, there are some producers in Kansas that are going to have pretty difficult situations to deal with before they put in the 2017 crop. If we have another year of that, there may be a bigger segment that may end up having difficulty before we go in. With that, are there questions? The question is, are the buyers in Kansas of land about the same, 75 to 80% farmers like Iowa? We don't have good numbers on that, but my suspicion is that yes, it would not be a lot different from Iowa compared to Kansas. Typically, other buyers of farmland, and it'll vary regionally, tend to be other farmers. So that's probably a pretty good number. There might be a little bit of range on that, but especially once you go to regions of the state, certainly that's going to be the situation.
How farmer friendly is the new administration going to be?
The question is, how farmer friendly is the new administration going to be? You have the mic. Why don't you answer that?
Yeah, in terms of this is, it'll be interesting to see who ends up being Secretary of Ag. In terms of if the senator from North Dakota ends up being Secretary of Ag, I think she's going to understand Great Plains agriculture. I think that would probably be a positive thing. In terms of nobody knows who that's going to be. Probably in another 2 weeks, that's going to be revealed. In some respects, you hear a lot of rhetoric about trade and whether or not we're going to get into trade wars and things like that. I tend to take more of a philosophical type view that the campaign rhetoric is usually extremes and then things go back more to normal levels. One of the things I think that's pretty important to realize that if you look at the population increases, of that roughly 2 billion person population we're supposed to increase between now and 2050, 1 billion of those people are going to be in Asia, 1 billion of those people are going to be in Africa. Does Asia have a lot of opportunity to expand agricultural production? If you go over there, they farm on mountains, and I mean they farm on mountains. It's unbelievable. You go up the hills and there's stuff that I'd be worried about falling off the hill just walking up, and they have plots of food and wheat or rice or those type of things. And so there isn't a lot of opportunity for them to expand land mass or in some respects increase their production. Africa has potential, but they're really messed up from a political standpoint. And so while I think they will, I think you're looking probably at 30, 40 years before that occurs. So the production is going to be in the Western Hemisphere. It's going to be North America. It's going to be South America. And so that's not where the people are. And so you're going to have people that are hungry in Asia, in Africa. You're going to have food production in North America and South America. And so either those people are going to have to move to these countries, which I don't think politically is less problematic than trade. I think immigration is more of a difficult issue politically than trade. And so my view is that we're going to end up trading. They're going to end up buying food from where it's produced. And so from that perspective, it's there. In terms of where they'll be in terms of farm policy, it'll be pretty interesting in terms of my guess is that they will not. I had the opportunity to be on a panel with Senator Roberts and Chairman of the House Ag Committee, Conaway from Texas, and both of them were adamant that they would not open up the Farm Bill. That was in September, and a lot has changed from September. My guess is, though, that instead of opening it up or re-litigating the current Farm Bill, my guess is that they'll go ahead and move with a new one. And so, but where that's going to end up, it'll be pretty interesting. They're well aware that things aren't working in terms of, I had a chance to speak to Senator Roberts before the presentation. And one of the things he said is, he said, you know, I hadn't heard anything about the agricultural economy until about July. When July hit, my phones and my staff started ringing off the hook with regards to what was going on in the farm economy. And so certainly, I think there's awareness in Washington that there's issues there and that something's going to have to be done in order to watch it. I'm not sure where they're going to end up going. My guess is they'll rely on crop insurance a little bit. I don't know where it is, and again, we see the problems with crop insurance in terms of how that changes from year to year, but that's kind of in the mindset, and so so it's a very open question. Hopefully I've danced around your question long enough, but I don't think I don't think we're going to end trade. I just think that rhetoric has probably been overblown.
When we started trading with Russia, before 1980, in the 70s, we did not raise enough trying to send to Russia. And then when they did that embargo on Russia, it caused that 80s to happen to us. Those farmers don't remember that's what caused that to happen. And when we go back and start trading, Russia was a great person to trade grain with. We loved it in the 70s.
Yeah, in terms of the question was, in the 70s, we did a lot of trade with Russia. Will we go back to that? In some respects, and there's a lot of political discourse going on with Russia. The big thing that's changed with Russia is now a grain exporter. And so the thing is Russia is producing excess grain. Probably the big hope, if trade would open up with Russia, would be moving livestock products in there. Probably most chicken, in terms of used to be a big chicken importer from the U.S. Perhaps beef, and so we may be able to move beef and chicken in. But in terms of the grain, Russia has improved their agriculture such that they're now an exporter of grain. And so they're more of a competitor there than a purchaser. And so unless they would end up with a situation where they ended up with such a drought, I don't think that's a possibility for the market. I think our markets are going to be in Asia, the Middle East, and in Africa to some extent.
When we sell grain to China, do they charge us a tariff like we export?
Yeah.
Do we pay tariff?
Yeah, the question is what is the tariff situation when we export grain to China? I'm not sure. Do you? We'll see if we can find out yet today. And
Trump alluded last week that when we import stuff from China, we don't get a tariff on like goods and services. We export stuff. There was, he kind of alluded that there might be a tariff on it. I was just curious.
There is a tariff on some stuff. I don't know if there is on grain, but probably the big issue with regards to grain in China, and they're actually changing this, but if you would grow corn in China, you would be guaranteed for the crop that you put in 2016, $10 a bushel. How many of you guys could make money at $10 a bushel corn if you knew when the crop in 2016 was going in, you were going to get paid 10 bucks a bushel for it? Yeah, you guys could all make money and we wouldn't be here. You would be having fun instead of thinking about an agricultural economy that's struggling. But the thing is China now has realized that they can't continue to do that. And so they're beginning to back that down. And in some respects, I think that's a positive as we look at China, simply because they've realized that they can't, especially at prices for corn of where they are, they're subsidizing $5, $6, $7 a bushel. Well, they can't continue to do that because it's going to break their bank. And so they're actually going to start reducing that, which in some respects I think is going to allow opportunities for other commodities to go in. I still think they're going to be political in terms of they're going to end up finding stuff that they don't like to keep the market on edge. But if their incomes and their economies continue going, their big issue is their middle class is expanding rapidly. And so they're ending up going from a grain-based diet to more of a protein-based diet. And so that's one of the things that happens when people get into a middle class. I always ask people to think about when they were a college student, and I like doing this with the college students. I indicate how many of you are going to have the same diet in 5 years that you're eating now. Well, every one of them isn't going to have the same ramen noodles, 17 ways of preparation in order to do it. They end up diversifying their diet. You don't need to tell that part of the story. They have to keep that middle class happy.
Well, I don't mean to cut folks off, but we just go ahead and let us come on and talk about production livestock. Great questions. Keep asking. So we'll transition. Dr. Mendel came to us from Colorado State about a year and a half ago. We graduated from K-State, so it's not all that. And he's here to talk about livestock cost reduction. And I'll follow up talking a little bit about cost reduction. And we're just trying to give you a sense of where we're at and what the cost categories are that make some progress on. No, not that button.
There's that one. I was just looking. I got it. Not with the two mics. I'm not used to this. Good morning and welcome and thanks for coming here today. We realize you guys are busy and we do appreciate you taking the time to come up here. As Michael pointed out, my name is Dustin Pendle. I'm fairly new to K-State, although I did go to school here way back in the day, so it's not completely new. We are going to do a joint talk like the previous one, and we're going to talk about opportunities, potential opportunities to save on cost of production. We'll start off with the livestock, and then we'll switch gears here in maybe 10 or 12 minutes, and Mike will talk about the crop side. Probably don't need to spend a lot of time on this. Let's try to motivate this talk. About 2 weeks ago, the USDA Office of Chief Economist released their 10-year projections for the different commodities. I pulled out the beef specific, and I highlighted just your fed cattle and your feeder cattle prices. And if you start on your left here under the recent, you just kind of work your way to the right or fast forward across time. What do we see here more recently versus 2026? Not good. It's what somebody, I read the lips. The point I was trying to make here is, at least over the next 10 years, which a lot of things can change, I realize that, but they're not necessarily projecting prices to go up, to be higher than maybe what they are today. We're not going to get back into those 2014, early 2015 prices. Okay, so that's kind of the take-home message from this particular slide. Livestock Marketing Information Center out of Denver. They post kind of what they estimate cow-calf annual returns are. These are your returns over your cash costs, your variable costs. 2014 prices, returns, 15. We see what's happening in 16. What I wanted to point out here is that 2017, that one on the very far right. Again, it's not projecting in the short term to turn around. Okay. So now what we did is we dug into the KFMA, Kansas Farm Management Association's database, which Alan and Michael talked about previously. Specifically, we're looking at the beef cow calf enterprise returns above variable costs. And we took those variable costs, or we took those returns, and we broke them up by profit categories. We broke those operations up into thirds. So we took the profit, we ranked them 1 to 74, 72, and we broke them up into thirds. And we categorized those as your top third in terms of profit, your middle third, and your lower third. And so then we got some characteristics of those operations. We've got the price and the weight, gross income, and then we got all our expenses. And the question here on the slide, it says, what are the categories that separate the top third, this column right here, versus the bottom third, far right column? Well, is it your price? See if the price they received between those two. That's probably not it. Weight, about a 40-pound difference, but that's, again, probably not driving a lot of this profitability. 37, almost 38% of this difference in gross income between your top third and your bottom third, or sorry, between your top third profit and your bottom third profit per cow, is because of your gross income. So roughly, 38% of that gross income is, the difference in the gross income is because of income. So where's the other 62%? Well, it's coming from the cost side. And so that's what we're going to focus on the next 3 to 4 slides, is the cost aspects. So I pulled, you're looking at a chart here of that bottom portion of that table, the costs. This is for all 72 of those operations, kind of the average. Two things I really wanted to point out was this purple area, which is the feed costs, which is approximately 50%, 48%. So 48% of those total costs, of those variable costs, are feed. And then the second thing I want to point out is that little red, 21%. That's your pasture. So between your feed and your pasture expenses, it's about 70%, 68% of your total variable costs. Now, if we compare that top third group of producers to that bottom third in terms of profit, we looked at the differences. And this, it's about 60%, 55%, that purple area is due to the feed. So $133 per head difference between your top third and your bottom third producers is a result of feed. So what we want to do is we want to spend the next few minutes kind of honing in on that purple piece there. Earlier this year, a couple animal scientists at Iowa State released a short 2-3 page paper that talks about ways to reduce feed costs. And a couple things that popped out that to me that we're going to focus on is this extended grazing season. How we extend that grazing season as an opportunity to reduce those feed costs and minimize waste costs. We'll talk about hay. But there are a number of other suggestions here as well. Crop residue, first one. Talking about running your cows, suckers, maybe in some corn stalks. There are some advantages, some disadvantages. Some of your advantages, feed savings, as we just pointed out. Potentially could reduce some wear and tear if you put them here as opposed to maybe dry lot. Additional income. If by that we were thinking, if maybe you don't have any crop ground, this is an opportunity to maybe develop a strategic partnership relationship with a crop producer, where you could possibly the crop producer could get some additional income. You could have access to some corn residue or crop residue. There are some disadvantages. Some people argue that you remove nutrients, organic matter, but again, that's going to be a function of how long you probably leave those cows on the stalks. Will require fencing if it does not have it. Possibly you might have to bring water as well. Lack of shelter, and then soil compaction. The soil compaction, you see this show up in the literature a lot. Although there was a recent study, 2015, that was done by Nebraska, Lincoln, that looked at this. They had a long-term study where I think it was 16 years, where they ran cows on crop residue, and then they followed up with corn and beans. And what they found over that 15 or 16-year study was there was no difference between yields where they ran livestock on the crop residue versus when they did not. So some of the studies suggest it, some don't. It's probably going to be a function of some other things as well. What's the soil? How long you leave those cows on that ground? How much rain, etc. Here's just some cost figures we were able to come across when renting out or leasing some of the crop residue. Here in Kansas, in the River Valley, Post Rock districts, crop residue range from anywhere from $3 to $25 an acre. Cover crops, we're going to talk about that next, but since it's here, we'll just mention it. $10 to $15 an acre is another what we found in the state of Kansas. Nebraska's got a survey they did in 2015, $10 to $15 an acre for crop residue. Iowa State earlier this year put out what they're forecasting for their cash rental rates, and they were looking anywhere from $8 to $19 an acre for the crop residue. Cover crops, which we just mentioned, is another possibility to kind of extend that grazing season. We are hearing of more and more producers that are doing this, planting cereal rye, radishes into some crops such as corn. Some advantages: it might improve soil and water quality, helps with erosion control. It is like crop residue, it is a feed source, so it could potentially help minimize some of those feed costs. Disadvantages, as we saw before, if you don't have fence, water, that is another cost. Could increase your cost of, then you have to possibly purchase seed, plant, those cover crops, etc. If you've never done it before, you're going to have to learn a new crop. So it's some management, maybe possibly additional labor as well. And you depends on what the yields are for the cover crops. It might not make it, might not pay for it. We do on agmanager.info, we do have a decision tool for cover crops. Michael, Robin, and is it Doug and Jamie Lynn are all part of that down here in the Southeast. And so there is a cover crop budget tool on our website. Actually, it's right here, I guess. In the interest of time, we're not going to spend a lot of time going through it. If you have questions, we can come back. But it is on Ag Manager's website, and you can see they've got various yields in your different categories. Winter wheat is maybe another option to extend that grazing season. We've heard people talk a lot about the dual purpose wheat, or, you put your calves on maybe October, November, you run them through late January, early February, then you pull them off and you're still able to harvest a crop later. What we're hearing a lot more people talk about is the graze out, where they'll just put them on in October, November, and you run them through May, early June. So again, as Alan mentioned earlier, talking about the wheat prices and looking forward to next year, we're starting to hear more of discussion on maybe grazing out the wheat as opposed to the dual purpose. There are some decision tools for this as well, if you're interested in knowing more. OSU, Oklahoma State University, obviously they do a lot of this kind of grazing. They've got some nice electronic decision tools. Also have some information on both the grazing and the graze out on our Ag Manager website as well. So those were just some opportunities to extend the grazing season, maybe to try to minimize some of those feed costs. Another area of those top 10 ways to kind of reduce or minimize feed costs was minimize feed waste. And so we've got this slide here. There's two sources of waste lost. It can be either from storage or due to feeding. So storage, whether you store outside on the ground versus maybe storing it if you have access to storing it inside and ship. And so there's been a lot of research done at the various institutions, various universities, and they found anywhere from about 5 to 40% hay can be lost due to storage issues. Feeding, a source of loss there, it could be either due to the bales or how you feed the hay. And obviously, this particular method, if you take a round bale and you put it out in a pasture, it tends to have the highest loss. I believe Colorado State University had a study that found there's up to 50% loss by kind of the method that you're seeing right here on the screen. Another way that would reduce that is you put a ring around it, right? A ring bale. And there are other various methods as well. If you take into account these two ways in which hay is lost, looking at the current price of hay, I think we average at about 65. I think we use $65. It can range anywhere from $12 to almost $60 per cow over the winter. And so if you go back maybe 5 slides, 6 slides, we had that one pie chart, right, that had the difference between your top end producers and the bottom third. The feed was $133 per head. So that's almost half right there by minimizing feed waste. And so these little things, although maybe they seem minor, they definitely can add up in a hurry. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about crops. Which one do you need?
Well, I want to just real quick go back to the waste slide. And you know our Barbie? You know this was Elkham. And we drove around the state a couple years back, and Art's the very gentleman. And they had small houses in their hay. So they would stack them in big houses, 4-meter houses. That was their but that was the only one that I can tell you. Pockets. I have to tell my husband I need a whole new wardrobe in order. All right. Here we go. This table up here is Kansas Farm Management Association data. I lost my thing. How'd that happen? Any members of KFMA in here? All right. Thank you very much. If you're not, why not? Okay. We have really good data from the state of Kansas via KFMA that allows us to see kind of what's going on in the state with cost of production, so that we have a pretty good sense of how much it costs you to do what you do, and where the possible areas are for you to improve. So what this is 2015 corn enterprise data. So not looking at the rest of the farm, just looking at what it costs you to produce corn. And we broke it out by the highest profitability third, the mid third in terms of profitability, and the lowest third in terms of profitability. Okay, and so the first thing that I thought of when I looked at this was, okay, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to figure out what it takes to be a high profit producer, right? That seems like a worthwhile thing to do. So what are the categories that separate that top third from that bottom third? Because if you look down here at our numbers, you're going to go from making $61 an acre to losing 145. So you definitely want to be not in the bottom third, right? Okay, here's what doesn't appear to affect profitability, and that is price you receive. The difference in the price received between my top third and my bottom third producers is all of about 9 cents a bushel. Okay, now I don't want to say that marketing doesn't matter, because it does, and paying attention to how you price your grain and having a strategy, those are all worthwhile things. But the price you receive does not differentiate you from the other producers. What differentiates you are the costs and how you manage those costs. Now, the fixed costs down here, the land charge, the depreciation, the operator labor, those are a little bit lower for our highest profit farms because they're also operating more acres. And so you can take those fixed costs and you can spread them over more acres, and that brings those costs down. But let's just look at the variable costs for a minute. And here's what I found kind of interesting was that I've got much higher per acre costs on fertilizer and lime, seed, chemicals, and custom work. Okay? So why? Let's think about some of those, and let's think about some different ways we might be able to bring those costs down to get you into those highest profit areas. So we're going to talk a little bit about, you want to be efficient with your fertility. You want to try to have some strategies for pricing those inputs. Okay, field management and labor machinery management. So let's start with this. I'm going to say right off the bat, I'm not an agronomist. I don't know any agronomists. I've never dated an agronomist. Okay, I am not qualified to speak about agronomic things beyond what the K-State guys tell me I am permitted to speak about. Okay, so all of my information comes from our K-State agronomists, and when I go into their office, they sort of roll their eyes and say, okay, we'll try to help you understand. But this was something even an economist can understand, right? It's a ladder, and it's a way of prioritizing your fertility management plan. Because when it comes right down to it, there's sort of an order in which things matter. And as long as you're taking care of those most important, those baseline things, the further you move up that ladder, the less impact those things have. And perhaps that's where we can cut some costs in the short run, okay? So let's talk for a minute about soil pH. It is sort of underlies everything with regard to the efficacy of the rest of the stuff that you put on. Okay, so the nutrient availability, all the fertilizer, all the phos, everything else that you put on is going to be affected by your soil pH. So you got to start with that. Let's just take a look at this real quick. The impact of liming really depends on where you start, where your pH starts at. If you start at a pretty low pH, like 4.6, and you put on an application let's say it's, you know, 36 bucks an acre, putting on lime, and we know that that's going to last for several years. Depends on your soils as to how many years it lasts, but that's apply it now, 36 bucks an acre, but look at the yield bump that you get, okay? It's definitely worthwhile. Now, if you were at 5.1 and you want to bump it up to 5.9, you're not going to get as much bang for your buck, but you weren't starting at such a low point. Now, what I find interesting is the question of who pays for the lime? Who pays for the lime? You or the landowner? Both? Landlord? Both? Okay. It's an improvement to the soil that lasts for several years. So I completely understand why the landlord would need to be responsible for a portion of it, because let's say you're only renting that ground for 2 years at a time, but you've put on 10 years worth of lime, right? You don't want to be putting on that much lime and perhaps losing that lease, right? So that's a justification for the landlord doing it. But if that soil is at a pH of 4.6, just put on some damn lime, okay? Because the yield bump there is completely worth it. Here's another way of looking at it when it comes to phosphorus. So this chart takes us from up to 10 parts per million and then up to 20 parts per million. And this is what they call the building or the sufficiency recommendation. Okay, getting yourself up to that 20 parts per million, definitely worth it. That's a 50% increase in starter P to get you up to, that gets you up to a 95% yield bump. Now, is it worthwhile then to put on the next 10 parts per million to get a 5% yield bump? To be in that maintenance range? It's nice to be in that maintenance range, but do we need to be, especially right now? Let's get it up to sufficiency and call it good. And then we'll worry about getting above that and being in a maintenance area on a different year. By the way, if there's any input dealers in here, I'm sorry. What about nitrogen? Okay, how many folks soil test? All right, good. How many of you do the 6-inch soil test? How many of you do the 2-foot? Ooh. Okay, here's what I learned from the agronomist. Turns out that nitrogen leaches. And what? No, it doesn't? Not here? It gets down to the rock, doesn't it? All right, so how about the lime matters here, but nobody in Western Kansas gives a rat's butt. And here, apparently, you guys don't care about leaching nitrogen. All right, fine. Okay, there we go. All right, we're just skipping it. I will say, though, that just the ability to soil test, just the 6 inches, because the only 6 inches that you have, test that, okay? Be efficient. Don't be putting stuff on if you don't need it, all right? We have that sensor technology to be able to apply in a very efficient way, but you've got to have the underlying data to tell you where you need to be, okay? The point is that you get up into things like the secondary macro and micronutrients, and I'm pretty sure, because I've heard the sales pitches myself, you know, that there's these arguments for how that can be beneficial. When I speak to the agronomists about this, and I won't give their names so that they don't get any nasty phone calls, they basically say, what you're getting out of that is probably not worth it right now. So if there's going to be something that you skip, some of that extra stuff that's at the top of that ladder, you can skip it. Okay, how are we going to save on seed? I was speaking in the last 2 weeks, I've spoken to 2 different producers who had a seed buying strategy that they wanted to share with me. One of them, I don't know for sure, but I guess he's somewhere between 15 and 20,000 acres. He's out in northwest Kansas. The other one has 2 quarter sections in central Kansas, okay? So we got a pretty big difference in the size of these producers, right? But they both had a seed buying strategy that involved putting out a request for bids from their seed suppliers and saying, I will buy all of my corn seed from you. I will pay you cash, and I will buy it in November. Who can offer me the best price? And the interesting thing to me was I would have assumed that the guy out in Northwest Kansas had been doing that all along. And yet he said the first time he did it was 2 years ago. That was the first time that he had said, hey, maybe I can ask for something a little bit better than what I've been getting. He told me that in the end, he got about an 18% discount on his seed. Now here's what's interesting about my Central Kansas producer though. He told me he got a 12% discount. So you don't have to be huge. The bigger you are, the more purchasing power you have, the ability to probably negotiate that even better. So what happens if you aren't very big? I bet you know somebody next door who probably grows the same thing you do, right? And like, he looks to me like a very honest gentleman who's not paying attention. Hey, right here. Yeah. So you could say to him, hey, how about you and I go in on this together? And I'll give you my money and you will negotiate the deal, right? That's illegal. It is not. Is it illegal? It's illegal? You can't buy your seed for somebody else? Moving on. I need to spray. I think I'm going to spray tomorrow. Should I be driving into town today to buy the chemicals from the co-op? You need to be thinking 6 to 9 months out. Always 6 to 9 months out. You should not be thinking about tomorrow. Well, I mean, think a little, but not too much. When it comes to your management, 6 to 9 months out. Okay? Then I'm showing these cost categories to the agronomist, and he's looking at how much money is being spent on spraying, and he's like, well, their problem is that they're not getting into the field when they need to in order to spray it when the weeds are this high. They're going in when the weeds are this high. He's like, so they've got to just work harder at scouting their fields and being out when they need to. And I was like, yeah. And then I got back to my office and I started thinking, who would intentionally not spray their weeds when they needed to? So help me through this. If you're not spraying your weeds, it's because you're not getting out there before they get too high. What keeps you from getting out there when you need to? Mud. What? Let's call it weather. Right? But we all face the same weather here. So what separates us beyond weather? What'd you say? Well, yeah, there's definitely a management aspect to this, right? How much effort you're putting into it. But what are some other things? Okay. Remember how I said one of the other categories that was rather high was the custom hire? It's higher for my lowest profit farms. If you're waiting on somebody to come out and spray for you, if you are not the first one in line, you could end up with them coming out later than you want them to, and you're not knocking down those weeds as efficiently as you'd like to. But what if you own your own equipment? Anybody in here have a part-time job working in town? Nobody? You're all full-time producers. Every one of you. Okay. And you all run your own equipment. You don't let your wife ever run the sprayer, right? Absolutely not. Okay, well, you guys are killing me. Some folks have part-time jobs in town, right? Or even full-time jobs in town. And they're trying to manage that as well as farming. And so the challenge to say, okay, given my weather conditions and the fact that I work from 8 to 5, do you always get into the field in the most timely manner possible? Okay, so when the bank says to you, you need to go find a part-time job, first you say, how about what job, right? What job in town? Because I'm not making a lot of money selling John Deere equipment on commission. And number two, how does that affect your bottom line and your ability to be a very, very effective manager? We've got 5 minutes left. Do you have any questions before we break? Oh, yes, sir.
On the cattle side of this, would it be a good idea to invest in, say, a grinder in order to, I mean, would it be worth it cutting down the loss, like say on the hay, because if you're putting some grinder losing half of your hay, would the cost that you save from not losing that 50%, would that justify purchase of a grinder?
Okay, so the question is, by cutting down on feed waste from it being on the ground and getting trampled and everything, can you justify a grinder?
Yes.
Okay, how are you going to answer that question?
I guess it would depend on how much you plan on spending on the grinder.
Okay, that's a good starting point. How much does that grinder cost?
Quite a bit.
Quite a bit. Okay, 25 grand? And how many years are you going to use? But aren't you a pretty good mechanic?
We have one on the second.
Yeah, you have a good mechanic on staff? Good. Okay. Whenever you look at that kind of an option, and then do you know how much wheat feed you're losing? Do you have any sense of that? Because the trade-off is the extra cost of that grinder relative to the lost feed. So you really need to essentially start observing really closely how much feed you're personally losing given where you feed and how you rotate it around. Figure out what that feed is worth to you, and then compare that to what you're going to incur for costs on that grinder. That's how you approach that.
It's about a trade-off.
It's about a break even for you? Okay. So the other thing to think about is how does it change your labor usage?
Your labor, it changes the quality of feed
Okay.
and all those things, which in the end is benefits.
Okay. So it sounds to me like you didn't need me to answer that question. I don't even know why I come here. You're a tough audience, and you always like to remind me that you have no soil, and therefore nitrogen doesn't matter. I'm not going to forget that, by the way. Okay, any other questions? Why don't we take a break, and we'll be back here in, is it 15 minutes? Yeah, thank you.
Liquidity. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Again, just to refresh, the farm economy has turned quite dramatically negative in the last 2 years based upon what current price expectations are. And again, I don't believe the forecast of $4 corn for the next 3 years. That's kind of the expectation now. It'll either be higher or it'll be lower simply because something will change in the world to cause you to adapt. And in some respects, I think that's probably one of the keys is as you think about managing, you kind of have to manage for adaptation. And right now, you're probably looking more at the negative side, the lower tail, to make sure that you are positioned when the farm economy changes. And so that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time on. How do you position your farm to perhaps deal with some difficult times such that when the prices change and the demand increases, you'll be ready to take hold of that. One of the key things I think that's really important to focus on is liquidity. Liquidity basically is how well or how much wherewithal do you have to pay your expenses in the next year. There's a number of ways that it's measured, and we'll kind of look at some information, but there's a current ratio, there's a working capital, there's two working capital percentage type ratios. One is a function of income, one is a function of assets. They all tell you a little bit about roughly the same type of thing, but they're looking at it a little bit differently. And hopefully, as you think about your own farm operation, it's really important to think about where you are, but then to begin to look at, okay, based on where am I now, where might I be in 2 or 3 years under the situation? Simply because if you know that you're going to have a situation to deal with in 2 or 3 years, if conditions don't change, it gives you more time to plan for it. And many times it gives you more time to make better decisions. And so in some respects, what we're going to talk about here is thinking a little bit longer term. But first, to give you a little bit of information with regards to the ratios, in terms of the first ratio here that you've probably heard of is a current asset ratio, or a current ratio. It's just divided by your current assets and current liabilities. And so current assets, just to review, are anything that you expect to sell in the next year. And current liabilities are anything that you expect to have to pay for in the next year. You take current assets divided by current liabilities. Usually a higher number is good. A lower number is bad, although it is possible that you can have too high a current ratio, simply because current assets typically don't earn a lot of money. For example, one current asset is cash. How much interest do you get on cash? Virtually nothing. And so having $1 million in your bank account sitting in a non-interest bearing account, it's going to give you a good liquidity position, but probably not the best management situation. In terms of looking at that, where we've been since 2008, we went from 1.94 to 2.51. And then from 2012, it turned, and now we're back to 1.94. So in some respects, the current ratio is about where we are when we began this cycle. Another way to look at this, and you're using the exact same numbers, but instead of looking at it in a ratio, you look at it in terms of dollar terms. And so what you end up doing is just taking current assets minus current liabilities. This is known as working capital or net working capital. A lot of people always talk about working capital. To look at where we went from 142,000 all the way up to 298,000 in 2014. And from 2014 to 2015, we reduced our working capital by roughly 42,000. And so that's a fairly negative type situation. Part of the numbers, reasons they've went, is the average farm size and the average scale of farms in Kansas has kind of grown over time, so part of that's occurring. But one of the ways you can kind of think about this working capital number is most producer end up with a situation where they pay out a lot of expenses at the beginning of the year, and then they have the income 6-9 months later. And so in some respects, from a dollar perspective, where you can think about this working capital is how much money do I need to go from crop to crop in terms of what is kind of the cash that I need to get me through until where I am. And so in some respects, sometimes if you look at kind of the budgeting, one of the ways to think about how much working capital should I have is thinking through how much money do I need from year to year or income to income, realizing that income is very, very lumpy. You can also then begin to look at this. Again, this just gives the ability to cover current expenses with liquid assets. Although a lot of times, in order to compare across operations, they usually end up dividing it by gross revenue or assets to try to get it scale neutral. If you look at it in terms of working capital divided by assets, essentially you see that we actually peaked in 2009, and we've actually been carrying less working capital over time. It's moved from about 10.8% all the way down to 8%. And then the other one that you'll see, and this one is very misleading in this situation, simply because if you divide it by gross farm income has fallen faster than your working capital has. And so it actually looks like you're in a stronger position here when you're actually not. in terms of, and so you have to be a little bit careful with these ratios. But what we're going to end up doing is we're going to kind of go through a little bit of a spreadsheet example here. And this spreadsheet is available on Ag Manager. And in some respects, you can actually put in kind of some of your own numbers there. In terms of the blue numbers, are basically would be your actual farm numbers. And then the green numbers would be kind of assumptions that you would end up making. But a lot of my assumptions are just going to be based off what I calculated or my own numbers. For example, in order to get costs of this 90%, roughly I just took 502 divided by 558. And then I just rounded it up in order to get 90%. In terms of, I kind of like working in round numbers as opposed to thousands of decimals. Depreciation, this was the actual depreciation on this farm for 2015, and then I just divide that by my fixed assets. And so that kind of is where that 3% came from. The interest, essentially I just took my interest divided by my debt in order to come up kind of with a 5%, or if you kind of know what an average interest rate is on there. Tax rate, I just made an assumption. And then the other thing that here I ended up using is a dividend. And you're gonna say, well, wait, my farm doesn't pay dividends? Yeah, your farm does pay dividends. If you spend anything out to live on, that's your dividend. And so sometimes, for example, people will talk about a dividend policy, and people that have proprietorships will just check out and say, it's not appropriate for me. Yes, it is. Every firm has a dividend policy. You just call it by a different name. The way we call about it is family living. And so your family living is actually your dividend policy. In terms of how much you're withdrawing from a family living perspective is actually a dividend policy, and a dividend is going to affect company goals or farm goals. In terms of the higher dividend you pay, the slower you're going to be able to grow your operation. The lower dividend you pay, the quicker you're going to be able to grow your operation. But there's also some costs from having a very low dividend in terms of the rest of your family may not eating like a college student. And so there's kind of a trade-off there. And so that's kind of how you set this up in terms of, just to give you kind of a scale. And this is kind of the average Kansas Farm Management Association farm, where in 2015, they had about $560,000 in revenue, $502,000 in costs, $65,000 in depreciation. EBIT here is basically just income minus your costs and depreciation. That gives you, in this case, a negative $9,000. Ended up having another $21,000 in interest. That ends up giving you a tax if you just take 15% of that. And this is a negative number, and people will argue, well, okay, it's a negative number. Well, there's a couple ways you can do that. If you have non-farm income, basically the loss you have on your farming operation will set aside some of that. Or with careful tax planning, and there'll be a session looking at that tax loss you can actually carry over to offset income in past years or future years, given the current tax laws. And so basically that ends up giving us, in this case, a negative net farm income of $26,000. And then what I ended up adding back is your depreciation. You never write out a check for depreciation, and so your checkbook looks like you had a positive $40,000 in operating. Current assets, $527,000. Of that, current liabilities here were $271,000. You subtract those two numbers to get the net working capital, which is $255,000. Assets, fixed assets, this would be your machinery, equipment, land, any breeding cattle of $2.1 million. Total assets of $2.6 million. Long-term debt, $412,000. Take that minus the 412 is you get the 1 million, or roughly 2 million, and this has to add up. Then the bottom here, you're looking at, okay, I'm assuming here that we're going to reinvest the depreciation. And that's something you may want to consider or not. But essentially what this says is if stuff wears out, I have to replace it. And that's kind of a decision you end up making. And it's a decision you can probably make in the short term here in terms of whether or not you want to continue to do that or not. And then we have the family living assumption here. And this is probably a little bit high. I think the average in Kansas last year was about 53,000, although for 2014, it was probably 61, 62,000. So what then I've done is just say, okay, based on Michael's forecasts, and so if you don't like the forecasts, they're all Michael's. And essentially, I'm just going to assume that Michael is right for each year for the next 4 years. So essentially, what she ends up assuming is going to happen over the next 4 years is going to happen on this operation. And we're going to see where this operation is. One of the first things you begin to look at here is what's happened to our current liabilities. If I don't do anything and just kind of say, you know, 2015 was 2015, and repeated it in 2016. I'm going to continue it in 2017. I'm just going to farm the way that I've always farmed. Can you continue to do that for 2-3 years? Do you think your banker would be happy taking your current liabilities from 271,000 to 612,000? I don't think your banker would be too happy with you coming in each year and saying, you know, farming was tough, but you're going to help me out. You're going to give me another 80,000. Kind of repeat that over 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden your banker's going to say, I don't think so. And so in some respects here, we see a situation, and this in some respects is reflected in this working capital situation going from about 255,000 down to 85,000 negative. And so again, it's a situation, if we look at our total debt to asset ratio, we're taking our debt to asset ratio of about 25.5% to 38%. And so again, if we just continue, and if we have a repeat of where we are from an income perspective the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to put on quite a bit of debt with where we are. In terms of, you could say, well, this may be doable in terms of, Dr. Featherstone said that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the average was 35, 36%, so 38%. Well, it's a little bit more debt to asset ratio, and so we may be able to manage it. And that may be a true statement. And in some respects, it's going to be a whole lot easier to manage now, especially if we manage our interest rate policy, because interest rates are pretty low. We're paying maybe 5, 4, 6% for credit, as opposed to 10, 11, 8%, 7%. But certainly, if you see the operation is going that way, that you're going to be taking on a lot more debt, I certainly wouldn't take it on the current liability side. I would begin to say, you know, I don't want to be susceptible to macroeconomic consequences. I might want to fix some of this interest rate. But given this, how are you going to fix this? Your operations, so how are we going to fix this? This is a spreadsheet, and so we can begin to look at fixes. Thoughts? Because this is some of the exercises I think you're probably going to want to go through on your own operation in terms of thinking it. Like, to me, what I would do is plug in your own numbers in the blue spaces, and then begin to make your own assumptions in the green spaces in order to look at, okay, how could I manage for 2 or 3 years of a low situation? Again, hopefully you buy this insurance policy and you don't use it. For example, I bought life insurance last year. I didn't use it. That was a good thing. I think it was. Don't ask my wife, but I think it was a good thing that I didn't use my life insurance. But I'm glad I had it, simply because if something catastrophic would have happened, they would have survived. And so in some respects, you're probably looking at doing some insurance type things in order to affect that negative potential. So what are you guys going to do here? Okay, expenses. In terms of, you just listened to Michael and Dustin and they said, reduce your expenses. So we've been running about 90%. So how far can we reduce those expenses? How much do you think you can pull out? Economists always like to say control expenses. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. So how much realistically do you think you could pull out on your cost of production? Think you could cut them by 5% from 90 to 85? To give a little bit of an indication, we'll put in 85 there just to see what happens. Certainly if we put in 85%, it takes us from a situation where it was going to end up with a 38% debt to asset ratio to a 34%. And so that certainly helps some in terms of controlling expenses. The key thing is whether or not you can really control them to get that 90% down to 85%. And so that's one thing you can end up doing. Other decision processes you can use as a farm operator here. Other income. In terms of, there's two ways that other income could end up showing up. One is, for example, that would reduce the draw on family living. So for example, if someone could go out and get a $30,000 job someplace, essentially what that would end up doing is reducing maybe your family living expenses from $60,000 to $30,000. And so looking at this, and I guess we'll go back to the 90%. And so if you could either convince your family to live on half of what they normally had been living on, or if you could go get a off-farm job that would generate another $30,000 in income, essentially, again, going back to the 90%, that would end up moving you again to a situation where you're going from a 38% to a 34% debt to asset ratio. Again, you could begin to combine those strategies, but certainly that's one of the ways you can begin to think through this. With regards to essentially what it would end up doing is saving $30,000 over the next 4 years, and so that would end up putting you in another situation. Other drivers that you may have. It would be. I'm kind of simplifying this to do that, but you are exactly correct. You absolutely, in terms of if you're paying off your long-term debt every year, that would end up doing it. And so it would actually make this look worse than it was kind of going in. But from a long-term planning perspective, realize that these numbers are a little bit optimistic because you're absolutely right. Your lender probably is going to want principal payment in addition to the interest payment. But at least in the 1980s, a lot of producers went in and talked to their lender and just made the interest payment and were able to delay that principal payment a year. And that kind of wasn't, nobody was happy about it, but it was a livable situation. And I don't know whether or not lenders will be able to do that kind of going forward, but at least if you're paying the cost of the money and not being able to retire the principal, you might be able to do that. But you are exactly correct that you probably would need to be paying some principal down on that. But in this case, we're not doing that. Other thoughts in terms of, from a management perspective. How's your equipment base? Is it all well capitalized? Could you get away with a year or two of maybe not replacing some of the equipment, kind of running your equipment a little bit longer, maybe realizing a little bit higher repair bill on that? something you might want to look at. Again, every solution is going to be different for every operator, but to begin to think about this, instead of replacing this, maybe you just want to say, okay, this year here, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zero out this investment, realizing I'm going to end up having to pay a little bit more in repair bills, and so my 90% might go up to 91%, but you can end up seeing, and again, going back to 60,000 there. Again, if you do it for 1 year, it gets you a little bit. You'd probably have to do that for 2 or 3 years. And again, I don't know whether or not you can end up doing that. You're going to have better repair type things. But again, that's one of the strategies that people think about in terms of whether or not we need to replace this equipment or not. In some respects, this is probably a positive of where we are, because in general, I think our equipment is in pretty good shape going into this situation, simply because we had some good years before we're going into the situation, and I think a lot of individuals updated that equipment. But that's certainly one of the things that people are going to need to probably think about doing. Other thoughts? Stretch some of your long-term debt. The other way is maybe to go ahead and pay off a big portion of your current liabilities and get it all on long-term, such that it's a fixed interest rate, such that it is stretched out. How much do we want to refinance or stretch out in terms of our debt? You got a number? You can make one up, because that's what I'm doing on these changes. So 100,000. And so going back here and first see if I can undo my last change. And so essentially I have a situation where I'm going to take 100,000 and refinance it. Again, it's not going to change my long-term debt to asset ratio much, but it's going to help my working capital situation in terms of I went from a negative to a positive. The thought would be is maybe instead of 100,000, maybe we would end up doing 200,000 or 300,000. The key thing is we're moving this from a variable interest rate to a fixed interest rate. So essentially, no matter what the incoming Trump administration does from an interest rate perspective, your interest rate isn't going to change. You have that fixed. Looking at that, you can see actually we've went up there, but from a working capital perspective, now we're probably not going to have to go to the banker each year in order to put our next crop in. And so we're not going to have to continue to go to our short-term lender and saying, well, I need 80,000 more, I need 80,000 more, I need 80,000 more. You kind of have it such that you do this once and kind of position yourself for 2 or 3 years. What happens if if these forecasts are wrong? You end up doing that. You end up paying maybe about 1% more on interest, maybe 1.5% more on interest. What happens if all of a sudden income comes in and you didn't need to do this? Can you unwind this pretty easily? Can you go ahead and pay additional long-term debt without a prepayment penalty? Yeah. And so the thing is this is kind of your insurance policy, such that if times switch, you have the ability to go ahead and pay that down ahead of time and get yourself back to a better long-term debt to asset ratio. But again, the thing is, and why I kind of use a simplified type thing to kind of look at the long term, is I think kind of where we are, given the income forecast, it's probably good to begin to plan for 2 or 3 years. Some individuals may find themselves into a situation where they need to sell off some fixed assets. They may need to sell machinery. Is now a good time to sell machinery? No, the used machinery market, at least all the information I have, has dropped pretty substantially. It's very soft. What about your operation or someone's operation is in a situation where, you know, they might have to release a quarter section of land or an 80 of land? It's not a great thing. My in-laws were through that. My in-laws' dad had heart surgery, kind of open heart surgery, kind of bad bypass surgery in the early 1970s when they were first starting to do bypass surgeries. They didn't have health insurance then, and so they ended up with a pretty big fat bill. They ended up having to sell off land in order to pay that bill in order to keep the farm going. Was that a tough psychological decision to make? Absolutely, and we still drive by that land on the way to my parents' or my wife's parents' home, and that's still a psychological wound. But we're driving to the home where they're still farming. And so the thing is, they achieved their goal of keeping the farm going. And again, those are hard decisions, but the thing is if these forecasts are right, and if Michael's land forecasts are right, would it be better to make that hard-term decision now to sell that land, or would it be better to wait a year or two and sell that land? Knowing what you think about with regard to the prices. Yes? Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Certainly you can. Yep. Yep. But again, those are hard decisions in terms of they're definitely hard decisions. But the thing is that he was talking about $2,400 an acre. In 2 years, if the economy's tough, is land going to be worth $2,400 an acre? Probably not if Michael's forecasts come true. And so the thing is, it's a hard decision to make, but if you have to make it selling that 80 section to generate $2,400 today versus maybe having to sell 120 acres at 2,000 or 1,800, it's just one of the things I think to really think about in terms of as you position your operation to essentially go through this. The key thing is there aren't really any easy decisions. They're all hard decisions. In terms of operations will get through this. I think the key thing, though, is it's very important to plan. I think just planning for 1 year probably isn't enough at this point, given where we are and given what the expectations are. I think you probably need to be looking at 2 or 3 years making those decisions, simply because running it another year or two and then finding out, oh, I need to sell land, it's going to be more painful then than it may be now, simply because the amount of land in order to kind of solve the situation may be larger than it is now. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the afternoon session with regards to tax implications. Certainly there's tax implications in the example that we've had in terms of there was capital appreciation, and so there's going to be some tax management issues there with regards to looking at it. But I guess the key take-home message here is that it probably will make some sense in terms of looking at this from a little longer term. And we'll hop back to the last slide. If I can run this thing. And so, again, I think it's important to look at the long-term decision and really take a look at what are some of the levers and kind of figuring out if we make this decision, is that going to be enough, or am I going to have to do other things? And so certainly I think it makes sense to create and look at kind of what your cash flow situation is going to be next year. but also I think you want to use some type of tool to begin to look at a little longer situation, such that if we have repeated years of this lower price situation, start thinking about what are some of those options that you may need to make and when you may want to pull the trigger. Any questions? I think we have a minute or two for questions. Yes. The leasing figure would have been in the expenses. And so, for example, you had your revenue, you had your expenses. And so one of the ways, for example, you may be able to reduce that, especially if you have cash leases. We talked about reducing it from 90% to 85%. Well, if I'm able to negotiate a cash lease down, that would reduce some of your costs of operation. And so leasing is a great thing that Michael will be talking about in a little bit. But certainly that's an important thing you can look at. If it's a crop share lease, in some respects, you may be able to try to negotiate a little bit with regards to who pays what and what the percentages are. But certainly both of those would end up affecting your cost of production. Good question. Others? If not, I think we'll turn it over to Bob White. And Bob is from, you got about 6 things to wire up with. But Bob is with the FSA in Manhattan, Kansas. And he's going to talk about some of their programs.
Thank you, Alan. David, can you hear me all right back there? Okay. Yes, as Dr. Featherstone said, my name is Bob White. I'm with Farm Service Agency in Manhattan. There in Manhattan, I have the opportunity to oversee the Farm Service Agency loan program. This morning, we've taken a look at kind of where we've been economically, where we might be at, and some figures as to where we may be going. And then, as Dr. Featherstone showed, one option to consider is our credit situation, maybe taking a look at refinancing a balance sheet, restructuring our debt situation, that type of thing. And I just briefly am going to run over some of the Farm Service Agency Farm Loan Program options that are available to take a look and consider those. I'm going to talk about our guaranteed loans and our direct loans. Guarantee and direct, 2 totally separate programs. We wear 2 hats. Guaranteed loan is a loan that we provide a guarantee to a commercial lender. That lender makes the loan, and they service the loan. It's their money they loan, it's their interest rate. We review the guarantee application. If the guarantee meets our requirements, we're able to issue a guarantee, says they make the loan, they service it prudently, later there's a loss, we'd pay up to 90, maybe sometimes 95% of the loss they incur. That allows that lender to provide a loan to a customer they may not be able to otherwise loan. So for example, if in the example Dr. Featherstone just showed, where we're potentially moving short-term debt into long-term debt situation, if that puts us in an equity position that the lender may feel a little uncomfortable with, potentially a guaranteed loan could be used in that kind of situation. Both of them? Okay. Is that better? Okay. Loan limit is $1.399 million. That does become an issue for us, I know, in a lot of cases. $1.399 million loan limit on that program. Within the guaranteed loan program, we have farm ownership or real estate loans, loans for the purchase or refinancing of real estate. We can be used for actually more than just refinancing real estate, can be used for refinancing any debts and securing that with real estate. Up to a 40-year term, maximum term on that loan program. Operating loan program for the purchase of machinery or breeding livestock. It can also be used for refinancing debts, putting debt, securing that against intermediate term assets, up to a 7-year term. Line of credit, crop or livestock inputs, a 5-year line of credit where it's a revolving line of credit, loan up and down. And those are all available under the guaranteed loan program. Within the guaranteed loan program, something that's brand new, that's not necessarily going to fit every operation, but may be a possibility for some, We have an EZ guaranteed loan that can be used for any of these purposes here. That program is limited to $100,000, but it's a very, very simplified application process. Speaking of application process, you know, that's one of the first questions we get. We talk about our loan programs. I think most people would find beyond the easy guarantee, the typical farm ownership operating loan type programs, I think most people would find the application process not to be substantially more encumbering than they're probably providing to their lender now. You know, basically last year's records, current cash flow, balance sheet, that type of information. In addition to our guaranteed loan program that you get financing from a commercial lender, we have a direct loan program. In that situation, we're providing financing directly to you, the customer. We're your lender. We're lending U.S. Treasury funds. It's our interest rates. It's our loan to service. For all of farm loan programs, direct loans, there is certain eligibility criteria, specific eligibility criteria. And one of the main ones is recognition. We're not intending to compete with the commercial lenders we cooperate with. And so we lend in our direct loan program in situations where there's some sort of limitation that the commercial lender you normally work with is unable to provide that financing. Examples of that would be situations where there's a tight security margin, cash flow's tight, maybe it's a new startup operation or an operation recovering from a recent loss. Within the direct loan program, we do provide farm ownership or real estate type loans. I will state that in the subject and the context of restructuring balance sheets, one thing we cannot do with our direct farm ownership loans, one thing we cannot do is refinance debts. We can purchase debt, purchase real estate, we can improve real estate, but we cannot refinance debt using our farm ownership loan, our direct farm ownership loan program. I'm going to clarify that program just a little bit. The emphasis of our programs really over the last several years has largely been in this direct farm ownership loan program. We've used that program to help a lot of farm operations maybe buy their first purchase or whatever it may be. We're still utilizing this program a great deal. A lot of the emphasis of our program naturally in the economy we're in today is switched toward loans that we can use to refinance debt and restructure balance sheets. But quickly, the down payment program required down payment of 5%. Our rate's 1.5%, 20-year term. 45. We lend up to 45%. Lender lends provides 50%. For this program, not necessarily every program, not at all every program we provide, but specifically for this program, the applicant must be an underserved applicant or a beginning farmer. Beginning farmer is somebody that hasn't farmed for more than 10 years and doesn't already own more than 30% of the average size farm, or an underserved applicant is a member of protected race or a female applicant. 50-50 loan program. Additionally, again, for the purchase or improvement of real estate, we lend 50%, commercial lender lends 50%, our rate's 2.5%. 300,000 loan limit on this. And then we have a 100% loan program where we can lend up to 100% of the financing. Again, 300,000 loan limit, rate 3.25. In addition to farm ownership loans, we do have operating loans. These loans can be used for refinancing debt, and we are seeing a lot of use of that. So we could purchase livestock, machinery, provide input expenses, or refinance debt. Maximum term is 7 years. We can write the note for up to 7 years, but we can also do an amortization period up to 21 years if we have adequate real estate collateral available. So we can do a balloon with a 21-year amortization schedule. 2.25% rate on that, 300,000 loan limit. Kind of like the EZ guarantee, it's not going to fit every operation, but for some operations it could be applicable. We have microloans up to $50,000 for farm ownership or operating loan programs. Additional, like the EZ guarantee program, a little less paperwork, and there's probably less collateral requirements for the EZ or for the microloan program. Emergency loan program, emergency loans based on natural disasters due to the loss, such as a flood or a drought. 500,000 loan limit, 3.25% rate. We do the calculations based on the result of the operation from that disaster. And we throw in here too, we've got a youth loan program up to $5,000 for members of 4-H or FFA type programs. For interest rates or more information on our programs or application information, one route to go is to take a look at this website. An alternative to that is really what I'd suggest is this bottom thing, contact the local FSA farm loan team. I'm going to jump ahead a couple slides. You have in your handouts a map that looks like this. This is the map of Kansas with our 21 farm loan offices on it and contact information to our specific farm loan office down here. And if you've got questions on our programs, the best thing to do is contact the office. I will mention that in addition to our farm loan programs, we also administer a farm storage facility loan program. This program is not a farm loan program, and does not have the restriction that other credit not be available. And so a person can have a substantial amount of maybe cash on hand or be able to get commercial financing, still qualify for this program. This program can be used for a variety of purposes, grain bins, hay barns, that type of thing. We're expanded the program into produce and that type of thing. Also, we've recently expanded into some handling facilities, some handling equipment, that type of thing, to process or transport the commodities being raised. So kind of in summary, we've got our guarantee and direct loans and farm storage facility loans. Within the guarantees, we've got farm ownerships, the operating loans, line of credits, an easy guarantee up to $100,000. Direct loan program, again, farm ownership and operating loan programs, microloans up to $50,000, emergency and youth loan programs. And as I stated, this is the contact information for our 21 offices around the state. Any questions about Farm Service Agency farm loan programs? Okay, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you about those. Thank you very much. See if I can get unwired here.
Yeah, and I turned it, but I think is the red light on or off? That's on red. Okay. Yeah, I hit it again. Thank you, Bob. All right, well, we really appreciate having Bob come all the way he's coming to all of our meetings all across the state. We've been partnering up with FSA for a lot of our work on the Farm Bill and then also on this, because I think just letting people be aware of what opportunities are out there and what your options are is really important. So we really appreciate him traveling around with us and having to listen to our talks 10 times, I think, in total. That's tough. That's tough. So we appreciate that. Since I'm having to take all of the blame for the price forecasts and the land value forecasts, I should get some credit for something, right? So we'll try to figure out what that is later. I'm standing between you and lunch, and the ladies out there have set out an entire display of this cake that looks amazing, and then there's some peanut butter cookie something out there. So let's see if we can get this done. All right. We talked about land values earlier. I made the argument that the profitability of farming right now does not support the land values that we have. So we have to see some kind of an adjustment. But let's take a look at how quick these adjustments happen, just looking back at historical data. This, again, we're going back to Farm Management Association data. This is the profitability by enterprise, so for wheat, corn, beans, and milo. And what you could see is that it was 2014 where we first saw that drop off in profitability, and then in 2015 it happens again, and it's really stark relative to the above zero profits that we had for several years in a row. So we know that profitability can change very quickly, right, from one year to the next. But then we look at land values and say, well, okay, those are a little slower to adjust. we have actually seen a slight downturn. This is the second year in a row, the 2016 estimates from USDA for our cropland. Pasture land, actually this was the first time, this year was the first drop in value on pasture. So land values are a little bit slower to adjust, even though profitability can, you know, switch on us like that. And then there's rental rates. And you look at those rental rates, and that would that indicate to you that we have negative returns? It doesn't move very fast, does it? Well, why is that? Why is it that rental rates don't adjust as fast as profitability, or even as fast as land values in some cases? I'll pick on you. Why? Well, that's the first problem. We're dealing with humans. Okay. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to assume you're talking about your landowner. Okay. So he's talking about the landowner. They just expect that they were getting good money. Why can't that keep going? Okay. Other reasons. Competition. Okay. I mean, we had several good years. It's quite possible that your neighbors still have some money, right? So there is still some competition for ground. That hasn't necessarily all dissipated. What else? Say that again? Yes. On average around here, well, on average for Kansas, we have a segment that does annual leases, and then we have another big chunk that's in the 3 to 5 years, where they set those rental rates for 3 to 5 years. And so you get yourself locked into something, well, you're not going to adjust as quickly because it's only been 2 years where we've had those negative returns to the cropping. So there's lots of reasons why rental rates don't adjust as fast as they would like. Landowners, and I'm sure I've got a couple in the audience. Let me just tell you a quick story. I got here in 2011, and by 2012 was looking for something to talk about so that I would get invited out to these meetings, and I decided to focus on land. That seems like a good topic. So I set about putting together, I was working with Kevin Duvetter at the time, and we were budgeting for what we thought people could afford to pay for ground, given what we knew about cost of production and what we knew about prices and yields. And so in 2012, I came to some meetings like this and I said, you guys should be paying more for your ground. Boy, I got some dirty looks, kind of like that one right there. Kind of like that one right there. I was projecting out for 2013 and I said, it just looks to me like you guys are making money hand over fist, so you should be able to pay. Yeah. And I had a few folks come to me, you know, during the breaks or after the meeting and say, yeah, you know, on the new leases, we're bidding pretty hard and we are pushing things up. Okay. So then 2 years later, this would have been last winter, I put out projections for it would have been for 2015 and then again for 2016 and said, it doesn't look like we can support those high rents anymore. And the farmers in the room were like, that's right. And the landowners in the room were not so pleased, saying, you know, but we should be getting more of that land. So if you have accomplished something, I think, when you can piss off half the room one year and the other half of the room the next year, I think that means that you're doing something impactful. Okay, so these adjustments are going to get messy, and in some cases it's going to be one side or the other having to say, look, I think we need to walk away, and I think that we need to, you know, I'm going to go find somebody else that can pay more. They may or may not find that somebody else, okay? But it's going to get messy. So that leaves us with, let's consider a scenario where you find yourself in a situation where you're paying more for that ground than when you run the numbers and you look at what you can afford to pay. And by the way, economists are different than accountants, okay? I almost failed accounting in college, but I have a PhD in economics, so I don't know what that says about me. But an accountant and what you get when you do your taxes at the end of the year, right? There's that kind of budgeting, and then there's the kind of budgeting that economists do where we say, well, look, you also have to pay yourself, and you have to have a return to your owned assets. Okay, so we're going to account for all of that. And when I say that here's what you can afford to pay, I'm also giving you a return to your labor, and I'm giving you a return to your owned land. And if you find yourself in a situation where you have either agreed to or you're needing to negotiate for some land and it's going to be more than what you think you can profitably afford for it, do you walk away? Do you walk away from that ground realizing that you've bought machinery based on a certain land base? You have labor in place based on a certain land base? And if you lose a chunk of ground, what does that do to your cost per acre? Fewer acres, same machinery, your total cost per acre now have gone up. Okay, so you're looking less profitable. So this is a tough call. How do I approach this? Well, the first thing we have to think about is your time horizon. In economics, we say that, well, in the short run, as long as you can cover your cash costs, as long as you can cover the costs of actually farming that piece of ground, okay, you go ahead and farm it. But in the long run, if you're not covering all your fixed costs, and the fixed costs are things like depreciation, property taxes, utilities, management labor, and your own land charge, well, you're not going to stay in business. So in a lot of ways, this comes down to, number one, the only way to answer this question is with having good data, having good information on your costs and your situation so that you can do this objectively. Because like Alan's story about, having to sell ground or even walking away from it, you walk away from a piece of leased ground, when's the next time that ground's going to come up for lease? Never. Never is the right answer. Never. Because land never comes up for lease. We struggle, we fight for it. There's only so much land, right? But the long run versus the short run, that's kind of tough. I'm going to pick on two individuals in the room because that's what I do. Pick on this young man. How old are you, may I ask? 22. And are you farming full time? Fam? Okay, I'm gonna pick on you. You don't have to tell us how old you are. He's older than 22. For the folks who are, on the Zoom connection, we've got a 22-year-old and a not 22-year-old. Okay, I'm gonna guess that if I looked at your balance sheet, you don't own a lot of ground. I'm gonna guess if I looked at your balance sheet, you own some ground, a little bit. Okay, so if you're the land that you're operating, you're probably paying rent on, right? They'll say you've got some, let's pretend, nod your head like, yeah, okay, I'm paying rent on it. Okay, you gotta play along with me, otherwise this doesn't work, okay? You're paying rent on it. And you've probably got a mixture of rented ground and owned ground. Now, how long can you afford to pay too much for rented ground before you run out of resources? You don't have to answer that question. I'm gonna look at you and say, how long can you afford to pay too much for ground before you run out of resources? Because one of the things you have that he doesn't is owned ground. And as an economist, when I look at how much you can afford to pay for something, I'm assigning a land charge to your owned land. Because you always pay yourself rent on your owned acres, right? Only in the good years. Only in the good years. And in the bad years, what do? You don't pay yourself rent on your owned acres. If all of his acres are rented, does he have the choice of not paying rent on some of them? So how long is your short run and how long is your short run versus long run? You see why this is not something that I can just tell you exactly what you should be doing? Because your situation versus your situation versus your situation, they're all different. Now, I picked on you two because I think that there is also a fundamental difference between our young producers who are just getting started, who may have paid premiums for the land that they have bought or that they're renting, versus folks who have been in the business for a while, okay? So we've got some folks who might be a little more susceptible to all of the stuff we're talking about today. And that's something to keep in mind here. Okay, so what do you need in order to make this decision? You need to have good data going back as many years as possible so that you can really be honest about your cost of production. okay? So that you're not guessing or that you're not being a little, conservative, but that you've got actual data that says, look, these are the kinds of yields I can get off of this piece of ground. This is what it costs me to farm it. And a complete list, in my opinion, of the pros and cons, okay? It would be nice if this parcel that we were looking at happened to be located the furthest away from your home operation, happened to be a really unpleasant landowner, and happened to be the least productive land that you had. Because would you feel bad about letting that one go? If you could make the numbers work, you would not feel bad about letting that one go. But if it is the piece of ground that is right across the road from you, it's your best producing ground, and you know that if you let it go, you're gonna have to drive by it every single day for the rest of your life. Okay, those things I recognize that those things factor into these decisions. Those go beyond some of the dollars and cents that we put down in our budgets. That's kind of how that works. So when do we let it go? Well, when negotiations don't move the needle. Now, if you had said to me in 2013, you know what, Michael, you're right. I should be paying my landowners more. I'm going to go home and get on the phone, and I'm going to call every one of them up and say, I'm bumping you up 10%. And next year, if things go well, we're going to go up another 10%. And here's why. Because I'm making really good money, and I can show you. Now, why would you have done that? And why would that help you today? Security? Because if you call me up today and say, remember how I showed you all of my returns, my cost of production, I showed you the profits, and I could bump you up? Well, let's compare that to today. And I'll show you where my profits are, and I'll show you why maybe we need to back off. If you are talking to them and you are sharing that information with them, it's pretty hard for them to argue that you didn't treat them fairly a few years ago, and that you're still treating them fairly, but that we're all in this business of making and losing money together. Okay? The tough part is when either you didn't necessarily treat them fairly, or you didn't communicate that you were actually giving them something that was in line with the market. I love the idea of informal bonuses. Makes people think that's how I keep my landowner happy. If I can, I just pay him a little extra. But did you explain to them why? Did you explain to them why they got that bonus? So that when they don't get it, or when you want to talk about coming back off of that base, that they understand why. That's called communication. Your wife's been nagging at you for 35 years about communication, okay? And here I am, a woman, nagging at you about communication. Okay? Are you listening? That's the problem. Okay. And there's other situations where you don't have a lot of choice and your lender just says, look, you have to. Okay? You have to walk away. You're paying too much for that ground. But we would really like to have this be a little more under our control. We would like to have such a good relationship with our landowners that we can get these negotiations where they, to a point where it is equitable and fair for everybody, okay? Keep in mind, you might have some landowners who want to be able to rent to you at the rent that is profitable for them, but their property taxes are higher than what that rent payment is. So they're facing some interesting situations too. Okay. So it comes down to comparing costs of keeping the parcel. We're gonna, looking at the loss of dollars if you farm it. Can you cut other costs to keep your land base? We love going back to that family living expenses. You just go home and tell your wife that she is going to have to spend less money on everything. See how that goes, okay? That's a tough one. We like to throw that up there as, yeah, get some of those other cost categories down. Then you can afford to pay more for ground. The loss of dollars from subleasing it. So we sometimes get creative in periods of tough financial situations. Here's a scenario. You have agreed to rent some ground from someone. Let's say you're my landowner, and I've agreed to pay you 50 bucks. Problem is, I'm gonna lose a lot of money at 50 bucks, right? But I found this gentleman over here who'll be willing to farm it for me, and he's gonna pay me 35. I'm still gonna pay you 50. But if I couldn't have made money, if I was gonna end up essentially losing 25 or 30 bucks on that, now I'm only losing 15. Now, why would you go for that? Why would you go for letting me sublet it out to somebody for this year? Any ideas? Yeah, I don't have to go find a new tenant. You can still work with me, you like me, we have a good relationship, and I'm gonna vouch for this guy, and you're still gonna get your 50 bucks, and you don't have to go find somebody else. I've had at least 2 different people in 2 different states tell me that they have seen this happen, okay? People are getting creative. What's so funny? Share the joke. What? Cost, if you let it go, you're unlikely to get it back. I use the word unlikely, you said never. Okay. You own too much machinery relative to your land base. If you own it outright, you can certainly idle some of that machinery. If you don't own it outright and need to generate income off of it, you could do some custom work for some neighbors. Here's a prediction. I will make the following prediction. I think custom rates are going to fall. I think there's a little too much machinery out there looking for a way to generate some extra income. So I think custom rates are going to fall. If you try to sell that machinery, there will be a tax presentation this afternoon. There are implications for that that you should know about, because you might end up paying taxes on that because you haven't fully depreciated out that machinery. You need to know that before you make those decisions. Okay, so we're going to run some numbers real quick. I'm just going to give you a quick example. And my example here is using the highest profit farms, corn, wheat, and beans. And we're going to decide whether or not to drop a 300-acre parcel out of our mix, because we are paying 75% more than we can afford. Now, I just saw somebody's eyebrows go up. Why would you ever pay 75% more? Okay, Labette County, that's where we are, right? I didn't screw that one up, did I? In 2013, K-State was saying you can afford 59 bucks an acre. By 2016, we said you can afford 25 bucks an acre. 75% more than 25 is $43 an acre. And $43 an acre, I'm guessing, is what some of you folks are paying. Okay? Now, I can't tell you what you're paying, because guess what? The only way for me to know what you pay is that you fill out the USDA survey that comes to you. And Montgomery and Labette County didn't fill out your damn surveys. So I don't know what you're paying. So Neosho 49, Cherokee 55. Don't get me started on the surveys. Fill them out. Okay, so we've got something to talk about here. Okay, so 75% more than what you can afford to pay. So here's what we look at. We look at the costs, and we break those costs into variable costs and the fixed costs, like I told you about earlier. So fixed costs is that machinery depreciation, it's your land charge, it's your management charge. And the variable costs are the inputs, right? The seed, chemical, fertilizer, and the machinery cost of applying all of that, and your harvest costs. So you drop that 300 acres. Here's what changes. The cost of actually farming that 300 acres, that goes away. So it reduces your variable costs by that. But it doesn't reduce your machinery depreciation costs. And it doesn't reduce your management costs. And it doesn't reduce the costs on your owned acres or the cost of any of the other acres that you're paying on. So all I can do is go through here and drop those variable costs. And what happens is I can get down to a net returns per acre, looking at where I'm at this farm, across the entire farm, without losing those 300 acres, I'm losing 25 bucks an acre. So if I drop those 300 acres, I can actually improve my situation. I can lose less money. Those 300 acres, I'm paying sufficiently too much that if I got rid of them, I could improve my situation. Now, I'm still losing money. I'm just losing less money. Okay, that's what the numbers say. Now, what if I was paying $25 or 25% more than what I could profitably afford to? Well, in that case, I actually make my situation worse. I wasn't paying really too much for it relative to what happens to my fixed costs when I lose that ground. But the only way to know that is what? Run the numbers. So this gives you something objective to look at, right? How does it change my overall cost structure? Then we can get back into the other considerations. But this is what paying too much for ground, these are the kinds of things that we have to deal with. Okay, so there are other ways to reduce costs. I call them reducing costs via rationalization. Unpaid operator labor. I don't have to be paid to be here. This is my lifestyle. I don't have to be paid to be here. By the way, 4 weeks ago, very nice couple, Chase County, sitting in my office, and the woman says to me, well, why do we have to pay ourselves? I said, would you like to take a vacation? Well, I haven't in 30 years. Well, maybe you would like to, okay? But she was sincere. She's like, why do I have to pay myself? This is my job. Well, because you should get paid to do your job. The land's already paid for, so I don't need a return. Okay? These are ways to reduce your costs. And you can do this in the short run. But if you're doing this in the long run, eventually you're going to run out of money. Okay? Eventually it's going to get too hard to keep this going. Other ways to reduce costs: selling machinery, selling land. Okay? It is not easy to sell assets. We work hard to get them, but there are situations where letting them go gets you to where you can fight another day, okay? Reducing family living expenses, intensifying your management decisions. So I'm gonna pick on the 22-year-old here one more time, okay? So I get out quite a bit around the state. And what the gentlemen with white and no hair tell me is, for our folks that started in the 30s, and for those of us who started in the 50s, and for the ones who started in the 80s, they turned out to be really good farmers. It's the ones who started in the good times who seem to have a lot more trouble. You will have to be an excellent manager to still be in business 20 years from now, giving me crap like him when I'm coming down here doing a meeting, okay? But the difference, if you make it for the next 3 years, you'll still be here 20 years from now. The folks that I worry about a lot are the ones who graduated from K-State about 4 years ago and were going back to the farm, and money was good and it was flowing and they were paying a lot for everything, and they're having a little trouble adjusting, okay? And by the way, all the things that we're telling you to do in order to save cost of production and be real conscientious about that, those are also the things that will allow you to recognize an opportunity when it comes along, all right? Because opportunities are gonna come along for you to potentially pick up some ground or buy some machinery or expand your operation, and you will need to know your costs as well as you do to keep your costs down. You will also need to know that information in order to know when you can expand. Okay, so this is a worthwhile effort, I think. We are within moments of lunch, but I did want to say one thing. At the very back of your booklet is a yellow sheet. It's an evaluation form. You can fill it out, rip it out, and either hand it to one of the extension folks or just leave it on your table before you leave today. Whenever you leave today, please try to get this filled out. Now, I don't know if you realized or not, but Dr. Featherstone is actually our department head, okay? So every January, all of us poor saps have to get evaluated by Dr. Featherstone. But this is an opportunity for him to be evaluated. So I think you should definitely fill this baby out, okay? Any questions, comments, or concerns? Are you ready for lunch? One, yes, sir.
When you had a chart showing the Kansas land value rates, I understand that it's probably reflecting that it is a little bit behind, but I wondered about the difference. You see the land rates, so land values going up, like the rental rate, especially pasture, was fairly flat. That's not the picture that I'm.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so the question was, on that chart showing state level pasture rents, it was pretty much flat with a slight increase, but pretty much flat. But the argument is, in this area, we didn't see that. I know you didn't. Those data are based on USDA surveys. But one of the problems with pasture rent, I think that we're not capturing enough of that inflation, especially when we did have a couple good years on our cows. We were getting very aggressive with bidding for grass. And so, no, it didn't get picked up. Those are numbers that I use to kind of present a point. But I don't necessarily think that they are a good reflection of the local market for rent. I don't even necessarily think they're a great reflection of the local market for cropland either. But yeah, on the pasture side, they don't reflect the increase. So, yes, sir?
Being on the receiving end of an estate settlement, I'm wondering if there's any information on how many times over a certain amount of time that land changes families' ownership and estates close down and the life of the farm is gone, and then another entity comes in and buys and picks it up and goes with it. Is there any information on that?
Okay, so the question was related to if we have any information on how long land stays in one family and then it would turn over and go into another operation. I don't know that we've got that kind of information. I started, I've got about 5 years worth of land sales data from Topeka. And it's great because it helps me to see, what's going on in individual transactions, but those data, they clean out the buyer and seller so that I can't see that, which is fine. I don't need to, but that's kind of a tough thing for me to track. Yes, sir.
You don't know, like, on the pasture and stuff, what the fair price would be. What would be a good percent, I guess, to make it simple, percent return on the investment for the landowner? I mean, what's a good value you feel like if you're in an area you don't know what pasture is,
Yeah.
no land to sell.
So it used to be that on cropland, we could say 5 to 7% was a good return. But as we saw land values going up so fast, that was being pushed down to 3 to 4%. So it's probably gonna eventually work its way back to a 5 to 7% on cropland. Pasture, 1 to 2%. 2% being on the high end. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. But well, the thing is I call fair the F word. Okay, because I don't know what that is. Neither do you. Right. Okay, so equitable in terms of sitting down and running a budget and comparing what you can afford to pay. That's a more accurate description. Saying to you, I paid X number of dollars an acre for this land and I expect a 1.5% return. So what? Okay. It depends on what the conditions are for the ability to pay and what in terms of the market locally. I've got strong feelings about how we should be paying for pasture, and it does not involve using dollar per acre numbers for the season. But I'm not going to get into that right now because I'm hungry, and so are you. Okay? But we can talk about that at another time. All right, folks, let's take a break. Thank you very much. Oh, wait, hold on, sorry. Sit down, sit down, sit down.
Don't worry.